No, do I make you horny, baby? Do I? Get it? Do I make you horny? No, you don't, because we never talk about sex, ever. Never. Well, hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player, where we are indeed talking about sex and love, for that matter. But sex primarily is the big bug word that scares everyone. Oh, we can't talk about sex. We're role-playing here. We're trying to tell great, fantastic fantasy and science fiction and modern setting stories. And there's no room in them whatsoever for sex or for love. And that's what it is. We're also primarily a bunch of dudes sitting around a table. And so having sex with each other would just be, would be weird or, normal depending on what sort of table you're sitting at. Or we're a bunch of women and we have three people who are not women and we can't talk about having sex with them because that would just be cringeworthy. The whole idea of sex and role-playing is that there's a fine line because you can role-play whilst having sex and theoretically you can have sex whilst role-playing, but can you actually have sex in role-playing? And that's a question that you and your GM need to answer. But as a player, how do you handle sex and how do you handle love? Now, the reason why I bring it up as a topic is because I think it's one of the most overlooked components of all role-playing styles, of all role-playing systems, is the fact that the greatest stories that we have in our arsenal of fantasy writings, in our arsenal of science fiction writings is in actual fact love and sex. Even in something as innocuous and as innocent as The Lord of the Rings, we had a tremendous amount of love and sex going on that was behind the scenes, that motivated a lot of the characters to do what they did. The love that Sam had, and it's platonic, the love that Sam had for Frodo, for example, his desire to make sure that his friend got to the end, the camaraderie, the love between Pippin and Merry, though not necessarily expressed, was definitely there. Most importantly, of course, was the romance between poor old Strider and his beloved, and whether or not he would ever get together with Arwen or not is a major question. And of course something that she ultimately sacrificed her immortality to achieve. So there's a long drive, there's a big drive of having sex and having romance and love in our stories. And yet we don't want to bring them into our role-playing because role-playing is a personal space and it's me who's on the table here and it's awkward for me to describe it. So does it have a place in your game? And it's something that you need to think about. Your GM might say, oh yes, no, I want lots of sex. I want sex everywhere. It must just be sex, 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 sex. Well, if you're not comfortable with that, then I would suggest that you tell the GM that. And if you're the only one in the group who's not comfortable with it, then I would suggest that either you play a character who embodies that uncomfortable space, who will shy away from it whenever the GM enters into that, but you are going to be doing that a lot because if that's what the GM wants, that's what the GM's going to bring in, or you just find a different group to play with who are not sex and love obsessed. So does it have a space? The next thing to think about is it appropriate for the group? So let's say, for example, you have a character who's let's say a courtesan or a companion or basically just a hooker and they want to go and make some money. Well, if the group that you're playing with are underage teenagers who are probably all having sex anyway, but if they are underage teenagers or they are an appropriate age in which to talk about these kind of things, then you must be sensitive to that. On the other hand, if it's a bunch of 20-plussers, well, then it should be appropriate for the group. How you describe what you go and do, though, is very, very important. And it's something that you need to decide on a personal level. Your GM also needs to decide and let the group know how far you can describe things. Do you really want to talk about engorged manhoods and all that kind of thing? Or do you just want to say, I start to initiate the lovemaking process and that's it. That's where the scene ends. You start. Maybe there's some roles. Maybe you say, well, the first thing I do is I pull out the whips and chains. However you want to do it, and then the GM should segue away to what the other characters are doing. Sex between characters, though, is where it starts to get interesting. How do you describe that? Again, it's up to the appropriateness of the group and what everyone else is comfortable with. I would never advocate that you go into graphic detail describing every thrust and thump that needs to happen. I would say that, again, you just simply mention the fact that the two of you sneak away, or the three or the five, depending on what sort of group you're in, the two of you sneak away into the room, close the door, and muffled sounds of ecstasy can be heard later on. That's as far as I would personally take it, but again, it's entirely up to you. A lot of people don't even want to take it to that level. There's a certain embarrassment factor. But that brings me to my next point. The whole idea about whether you should be shagging everything that you come across, or whether you and your party member should shack up together, is, does it make a good story? A youthful lad who has never been to the big city is now suddenly confronted with the red light district of the area and has all of these lascivious women who are pouring themselves all over this young farm lad. It makes sense that he would be enticed to do it. It also makes sense that he might be tempted to do it. So perhaps if he's religious, or if he's pious, or if he has of a personal character where he believes that he should wait until marriage, he will try and avoid those things. But there's got to be some kind of thinking behind it. It's just role-playing after all. So as you would think, should my character attack, you should also think, should my character shag? It's a natural process and something that every human does or tries to do or should do or may not ever do, depending. But it is certainly a part of who we are as a species. And so it needs to be there. If it makes for a good story, then I will always advocate doing it. If, however, it's just because you want to make somebody else uncomfortable, or because you perhaps personally enjoy talking about sexual acts with other people, well, then maybe it's not necessarily appropriate for the game and that you should be playing something else instead. Now, how far should you go? As I've said before, I don't like to go too far because the whole idea is to enhance the story and to build some kind of relationship or attitude or behavior around the character. If my character is just going into a brothel and is sleeping with a prostitute, he pays the coins, I say, right, we head up the stairs and things get dirty. No more than that. Because I'm about establishing my character as somebody who sees sex as merely a physical act and a tension release, and that they will go into brothels and they will shag whatever's there. If the DM says, well, unfortunately, it's only the most hideous of orcs that are left behind, I then get to decide, well, you know what, my character just likes to get his rocks off, so off he goes with the orc. Or, no, my character has standards and so won't go there. Or perhaps my character is an orc, in which case that's the most beautiful creature in the inn or tavern or brothel or whatever it might be. Now the next question to then ask is, what if the GM throws a curveball and has that prostitute fall in love with your character? Or has that barmaid or the farm wench or the starship captain or whomever it is that your character slept with? What happens if the GM now turns around and says, well, that person wants to see you again? That person wants to take it to the next level. What if in a tavern someone walks up to your character and starts to make small talk and starts to find out about your character? What happens when that person then declares that they would like to spend more time with that character? Again, it's about building up the romance, about building up the relationship. And for me, it's about looking at my character saying, how do they respond to that kind of come on? How do they respond to someone trying to romance them, to someone who's flirting with them? How do they handle that? If my character wants X, Y, and Z, then this is how they will handle it. This is how they will handle it. And I think it just adds a component of realism. That if the pixie floats up to you and says, ooh, I like what I see there. I like the way that you handled that big bully. You weren't unfair, but you weren't too rough either. Can I buy you a drink? How does your character react? How does your character respond? It just offers you, as the role player, so many more options, so many more avenues to explore your character and to get to learn a little bit more about them. and to drive them forward. It also means that your character starts to build relationships with NPCs. Now, of course, if you've got two players' characters that want to start to form a relationship, well, that's entirely up to you, and this is where it starts to get awkward. Again, generally speaking, if it's two people of the same sex busy talking it up amongst each other, they're flirting with each other. How far do you take the flirting role-playing? Do you have to make funny eyes and drop hints and that sort of thing? Or is it just something that you'd rather do with a role? It's up to you to decide. Your GM ultimately has the final say on how it plays out. But again, you need to know what your stance is on that, so that when those situations do arise, you can embrace them for the best possible narrative option that they will present. Now, a relationship between two players' characters is fantastic because it allows for story options, it allows for the GM to come up with different narratives that play out, but it also allows you to explore what your character is like in that relationship. Now, if you've never been in a relationship and so are uncertain, this is a great proving ground to see how those things play out. You might not know what to do, but you can certainly explore and attempt to discover things for yourself, which may not be appropriate for real life, depending. But again, it's how far do you want to take it? How real must the role-playing be? Because usually social interactions are not just a dice roll, there is a certain verbal component. Now, love is interesting. And there are many books and things on it out there. One of them, if you are interested in role-playing and in exploring how to express that in role-playing without it being awkward, so without you having to, okay, we make out, no, that's nasty, that's horrid, that's not going to make anyone at the table comfortable. But if you want to explore it further, there is a book, or there's many books, and there's websites out there called the 5 Love Languages. Now, these talk about the different ways in which we as humans express our love for others. And you can go and have a look at that and see what applies for you in real life, as well as for your character. Perhaps your character is all about services, or acts of service, where at the campfire, your character is the one who will make the coffee for the character that your character is in love with. They will sharpen their weaponry, they'll clean their armor. It's little acts which are not, on the surface, anything that anyone needs to get embarrassed or nervous about, but which shows that there is a romance that is building between the two characters. It also allows different things for you to do in those downtime moments. So if the GM has got you all to go shopping, well, if your love language is words of affirmation, for example, you might go with your significant other and compliment them on their choice of rope purchase, or the fact that they always think ahead and come up with the most wonderful plans. All of those little things will allow you to express the romance, to express the love without getting awkward, and of course to build that bond and to give you something to do during role-playing. So there's a lot of benefit to exploring love and sex. Now, something that is also important is when you look at non-consensual. I don't think I've ever had a player who has raped another character or who has raped an NPC, thankfully. However, what if your character is raped? How do you deal with that? It's an incredibly sensitive subject, and it is one that you must handle on a personal basis. If my character was raped by a creature, I would feel incredibly violated, and I would want to wreak any kind of revenge and havoc that I could possibly do on that individual. If I had a good GM, they would try and make me see that person's side, unless they, of course, are just a big evil ogre brute type of thing. But I would also then have it affect how my character deals with other relationships. They go into withdrawal, perhaps. They become more reserved, quieter, or more gregarious, depending on how they handle the stress of that ultimate violation. So it is something to think about. But generally speaking, I always advocate sex, and a little bit of love on the side, because it makes for more interesting stories, it makes for more interesting discovery of your character and what your character likes and doesn't like, and how your character interacts with others. It creates better bonds between your character and NPCs. It creates an incredible narrative between your PC and a fellow PC, And it just generally drives so much of a better story. If you're trying to find your love who's been stolen from you by the big bad, or if you are trying to redeem yourself in the eyes of a lover, all those kind of things come to the fore. And normally they're not even in our stories. They're normally excluded. Now, in my campaigns, I always try and include some kind of romantic component. And in the last game I ran with my players, it lasted for a year. And we had players who were in love with an NPC, and the NPC left, and the player did heaven and earth, moving heaven and earth, to go and get that NPC back. And the declarations of love and things were not cheesy or weird or awkward. They were sincere and honest. And once the two of them finally embraced and started to kiss, everyone at the table went, "Aww, that's so sweet," because that's what needed to happen. That story was phenomenal. And it had no plotting, no planning, no interference from the GM whatsoever, other than honest reactions to how that passion was developing and being exposed. So, the next time someone mentions sex, don't shy away from it. Embrace it. Do it. And make sure that your character steps away being better and more interesting than they were before. Until next time, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more. And obviously, as a general caveat, always be safe. And until then, we wish you and yours the happiest of playing.